Regarding the current strife between the Center for Genetics in Society and Dr. Michael Seringhaus on the topic of whether or not a universal DNA database has a place in San Francisco, California, I take side with Dr. Seringhaus because I genuinely believe that San Francisco's justice system will be able to operate in a much more effective and efficient manner in solving crimes with a dedicated universal DNA database compared to the current non-universal system, and society as a whole will benefit. A universal DNA database would dramatically decrease, if not eliminate, the frequency of false positives. A false positive is a phenomenon when two DNA profiles are reported to be a match when in reality the two profiles belong to two different people. This happens most often when investigators are forced to work with partial DNA profiles. Because there are fewer loci in a partial DNA profile, there is a greater chance for the crime scene DNA to match with someone completely unrelated to the crime simply by coincidence of similar DNA profiles. On a multitude of occasions, this has resulted in the individual being imprisoned simply because they were the first match. This is where a universal DNA database steps in. Although nothing can address the issue of partial DNA profiles matching to individuals not associated with the crime, a universal DNA database would result in multiple matches to the partial DNA profile, with one of them being the actual culprit. Instead of simply going after the first and only match, which has a chance of simply being a result of statistical probability, investigators would be able to cross-reference other evidence with multiple partial matches through a universal DNA database to identify the actual culprit. A universal DNA database would make the practice of familial searching, a typically unreliable and inaccurate search method, obsolete. Familial searching is a current technique where investigators, instead of trying to match a DNA sample with a suspect, try to match a DNA sample with the suspect's relative, whose DNA may have been retained from past arrests. This method revolves around the fact that the DNA profiles of relatives would share many similarities. The practice of familial searching is only utilized in 12 states, one of which being California. The questionable aspect of familial searching is the fact that it is not possible to guarantee a match. Everything is based on probability. This results in an increased rate of false positives, simply because an innocent individual happens to have similar DNA to the real suspect. A universal DNA database would eliminate the need for familial searching and, in doing so, drastically decrease the occurrence of false positives that lead to false imprisonment. A universal DNA database would address the concerns of racial bias. With the current justice system in San Francisco, a DNA sample is only acquired from an arrestee if the crime in question is a felony. This graph from the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice on the felony drug arrests carried out throughout the past 5 decades show that despite the amount of felony drug arrests having decreased in recent years, African Americans are still arrested at a significantly higher rate compared to those of other ethnicities. More African Americans arrested for felony charges means that San Francisco's DNA database would be more populated with African American DNA profiles than any other ethnic group. This would result in more DNA hits to be of African American individuals, resulting in more African American arrests, and the expectation for the next felony criminal to be African American. African Americans would also be more at risk of false positives as a result of being disproportionately overrepresented in the DNA database. A universal DNA database will include DNA profiles of all San Franciscans, fixing the racial bias issue. Instead of having a DNA database to essentially be a black DNA database, a universal DNA database would equally represent all ethnic groups in San Francisco relative to the city's population proportions. A universal DNA database would relieve investigators of practicing the retrieval of abandoned DNA. Abandoned DNA is a term given to discarded items that investigators can retrieve to extract DNA from. Such items range from used utensils to cigarette butts. The issue with collecting abandoned DNA is that investigators do not need your consent to rummage through your garbage for your saliva. For obvious reasons, this brings up a lot of concerns regarding Fourth Amendment rights, the rights against unnecessary searches and seizures. A universal DNA database would free investigators from the need to secretly collect your DNA behind your back and potentially violate your rights. The DNA profiles of the people in question would be readily available for investigators to retrieve instead of them having to follow the individual around, waiting for the next opportunity to pick up their discarded DNA. A universal DNA database will greatly speed up investigation processes. Current DNA analysis techniques take days, even weeks, to develop a usable DNA profile. On top of that, nearly all forensic labs suffer from backlogging, an issue where there are too many DNA profiles to develop with not enough time. This results in DNA profiles potentially taking months to be developed and, by then, the suspect would have been released and potentially out of police radar. With a universal DNA database, backlogging will be a thing of the past, as the number of DNA samples that need to be processed will greatly decrease. Without backlogging to hinder investigators, cases will be closed much faster and there will be less time in between collecting crime scene evidence and having enough process evidence to prosecute the culprit. A universal DNA database would eliminate the stigma that comes with being in a database by putting everyone in the database. Currently, the requirement to have a DNA profile in the San Francisco DNA database is to be arrested for a felony crime. Note that this does not mean that one must be guilty of such crime. Standard procedure calls for the collection of DNA once the arrestee is brought into police custody. If the individual were to be found not guilty of the felony crime, or even if their charges were dropped, they would be released, but the DNA profile would not. Instead, the DNA profile developed from their collected DNA sample would remain in the police DNA database, and even if expungement is requested by the individual, there is no guarantee of its removal. Despite this, it is assumed by both civilians and investigators alike that if an individual has a DNA profile uploaded in the DNA database, then they must have committed a felony crime in the past. With a universal DNA database, everyone will have a DNA profile, regardless if they have a crystal clean past or not. No longer will people be able to judge each other based on having a DNA profile, because everyone will have a DNA profile. Having a universal DNA database will make people more aware and more inclined to learn about current activities in the field of human genetics. As of right now, human genetics is not a very common topic among people. Establishing a universal DNA database in San Francisco will incite more people to discuss the legalities of topics related to human genetics. It would be more prevalent in politics, which is important because the field of human genetics is a very touchy subject that needs to be talked about. The more advancements there are in the field, the closer practices come to crossing the ethical border. A universal DNA database would bring the field of human genetics to the people and encourage them to think more about what is and is not acceptable in the field of human genetics. A universal DNA database will greatly aid in exonerating the innocent. DNA evidence is already being used today to help wrongfully imprisoned individuals get back their freedom. A living example of this is the story of William Richards. Richards was exonerated using DNA analysis after spending 23 years in prison after being wrongfully convicted for the murder of his wife. The actual killer is still unknown, but had there been a universal DNA database today, or during 1993, when Richards was arrested, this wrongful imprisonment would not have happened, and the real killer would have been apprehended. As reported by the Innocence Project, an organization that works to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals, 356 people have already been exonerated with the help of DNA evidence since 1989. This goes to show the amazing potential a universal DNA database has in helping wrongfully convicted individuals, on top of preventing any future innocents from being convicted for crimes they did not commit. Establishing a universal DNA database would eliminate the need for investigators to turn to direct-to-consumer genetic testing services for evidence. Direct-to-consumer, or DTC, genetic testing services are independent organizations that you can send body fluid to, typically saliva, to get a DNA profile. This is typically for individuals who are curious about their ancestry, or if they want to know if they are at risk of any genetic diseases. However, there have been many instances where investigators have relied on DTC tests in order to compare DNA profiles or familial testing. For obvious reasons, this leads to more personal privacy questions, but the main issue of this reliance is in the fact that DTC genetic testing services are very inaccurate. A 2018 study by human genetics specialist Stephanie Tandy Connor, MD, revealed that 40% of DTC genetic testing services reported a false positive for an absent genotype. This is a very dangerous revelation, given that investigators have used DTC genetic testing results to put people behind bars. If a universal DNA database were to be implemented, investigators would not need to rely on such an unreliable service for DNA profiles. A universal DNA database would prevent inaccurate DTC genetic testing results from endangering people's innocence. A universal DNA database would deter individuals from committing crimes. As mentioned earlier, a universal DNA database would allow investigators to conduct investigations more quickly and with much more accuracy. The fact that investigators would be able to easily identify anyone who leaves traces of their DNA at a crime scene, which is very easy to do, would serve as an effective deterrent for any future individual who might be considering committing a crime.